It was the autumn of 1987 when 27-year-old Hazel Morrow found herself standing alone in the yard of a 300-acre maple and hay farm outside Vankleek Hill, Ontario, watching the taillights of her husband's truck disappear into the gray October dusk. A kingdom of frost and silence. The sound of the gravel crunching under his tires was the last thing he left her. That and the debt. Let me tell you about that silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind that settles over the fields after a long day. It was the silence of a farmhouse that had stopped breathing, of a barn that needed a new roof before the snow came, of a tractor sitting in the equipment shed with a cracked block that no one had touched in 3 weeks, because Thomas had said it wasn't worth fixing. He had called the whole operation a losing proposition. He had called her father a stubborn old fool for refusing to sell when the developers came around in '84. He had called her sentimental, and then, in the way of men who have already decided, he packed 2 bags, signed his name off the operating loan, and drove south toward the city and a job in construction that paid better and demanded nothing of his heart. Hazel Morrow, she had taken her maiden name back before the week was out, was left with the silence, the coming winter, and a farm that needed more from her than she was certain she had to give. Her father, Rémi Moreau, had died in March of that year, pancreatic cancer. It took him in 4 months, which was mercifully fast but not fast enough for a man who wanted to be out in the sugar bush in April. He had lived 71 years on that land and died in the bedroom where he was born, which was the kind of ending he would have chosen if anyone had thought to ask him. He did not leave Hazel the farm in perfect condition. He left it to her the way he had always operated. Nothing fancy, nothing new, but everything accounted for, and nothing owed to anyone. The trouble was that Thomas had arrived with ideas. Not bad ideas exactly, but borrowed ones. In the 2 years they were married and living on the farm, he had convinced Rémi, who was already sick and tired in ways that made him easier to persuade than he might otherwise have been, to take out a loan for a second-hand loader and a new hay baler. The baler had broken down twice. The loader was useful, but financed at a rate that Rémi, in health, never would have signed. So Hazel inherited the land, the equipment, the debts on that equipment, and a farmhouse with a hot water tank that had been making a sound like distant thunder for 6 months. Now let me explain the world she was standing in. The late 1980s in eastern Ontario were not a simple time for mixed-operation farmers. The Quebec border farms were being consolidated. The big dairy operations to the west were squeezing smaller producers out of the co-op arrangements they depended on. There were men, and it was almost always men, coming up from Ottawa and down from Montreal in clean boots and good coats, carrying briefcases and talking about land assemblies and long-term agricultural investment portfolios. They were buying parcels, stitching them together, and either renting them back to tenant operators or converting them to something more profitable and less alive. Her neighbors knew the pattern. The Leroux family, 2 concessions over, had sold in the spring. The Beaumont place, which had run beef cattle for 40 years, was already half converted to storage buildings for a manufacturing outfit out of Hawkesbury. The consensus among the people who remained was not unkind toward Hazel, but it was honest in the way that farming communities are honest when the numbers don't add up. She was young. She was alone. The maple season was still 6 months away, and there wasn't enough hay income to carry the winter without Thomas's off-farm wages. They thought she would have to sell. Most of them thought she should. The week after Thomas left, Hazel drove the old Chev pickup into town. Her first stop was the agricultural lending office on Main Street, where a man named Mr. Caldwell, 3rd generation in the lending business, careful and decent but not, in the end, imaginative, received her in an office that smelled of paper and radiator heat. He had known Raimi. He had respected Raimi in the way you respect someone whose methods you don't entirely understand, but whose results you cannot argue with. He gestured for her to sit. He folded his hands. "Hazel," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you, because your father deserved straightforwardness, and so do you." He let that sit for a moment. "The operating account is carrying more than I'd like going into winter. With Thomas off the loan and the maple season not until March, the bank needs to think carefully about how it's positioned." Hazel sat with her hands resting on the knees of her work pants. She did not fidget. "There's an opportunity," Mr. Caldwell continued, his voice dropping slightly into that register people use when they're offering something they believe is a kindness. "A numbered company out of Ottawa is acquiring parcels in your concession. They'd absorb the equipment debt, clear the operating balance, and pay fair market for the land. You'd walk away clear. You could start over somewhere." He looked at her with the expression of a man who expected relief. She said, "I'm not selling." The words weren't loud, but they occupied the office the way cold air occupies a room when someone opens a door in January. Mr. Caldwell exhaled. He leaned back in his chair. "Hazel, be practical. The maple season is months away. You have equipment that needs repair. You can't run 300 acres through a winter alone. You have no hired help and no capital to bring any on." "I'll bring in the maple crop," she said. "The hay will carry what's needed until then. I'll have the loan current by May." He looked at her the way people look at someone they've already decided is wrong. He was not a cruel man. He simply did not see what she was made of because no one had told him about her father. Her father was the source of everything. Raimi Moreau was a quiet man with a third-grade education and a mind that worked like a Swiss watch. He had learned to fix things the way some people learn a language, by immersion, by necessity, by an early understanding that a man who needs to call someone else for every broken thing is a man who will spend his life paying for his own helplessness. He bought his equipment used and ran it long. He kept his land in cover crops over winter when his neighbors were leaving fields bare. He tapped his sugar bush the same week every year and made decisions about the operation with a consistency that looked like stubbornness from the outside, but was, from the inside, simply discipline. He passed all of it to Hazel. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone work on a piece of machinery the way a musician plays an instrument, with their whole attention, with something like love?" That was Raimi in the equipment shed. He taught Hazel not just how to do things, but how to listen. A loose drive chain on the baler didn't just rattle. It rang at a specific pitch that changed as the tension went. A hydraulic cylinder that moved slowly on a cold morning but caught up by noon wasn't failing. It was telling you the seal was due for inspection before next season. He didn't lecture. He handed her tools and talked while they both worked, his voice low and steady over the smell of grease and diesel and the particular cold smell of the old concrete floor of the shed. "People buy new things," he told her once. The two of them lying on their backs under the loader in the November cold, because they don't want to learn the thing they already own. That's not the equipment's fault. That's theirs. A machine that's been maintained right will tell you everything you need to know. You just have to be patient enough to listen. He left her 3 things in that shed besides the equipment itself. The first was his toolbox, a battered gray Mastercraft unit on wheels, 4 drawers deep, organized with the kind of precision that would have surprised anyone who didn't know him. Every tool had its place. A socket without its corresponding ratchet was, to Raimi Moreau, a kind of disorder that bordered on moral failure. The second was a shelf of binders, service manuals for every piece of equipment on the property, some of them photocopied, from originals at the library in Hawkesbury, their pages soft with handling and marked in pencil, where he'd found errors in the manufacturer's instructions. The third thing was a yellow legal notepad, its cover reinforced with electrical tape, set on the shelf above the toolbox. In his careful, deliberate handwriting, block letters, a man who hadn't been taught cursive, he had kept a running log of every repair, every seasonal service, every part number and supplier and dollar amount going back to 1971. It was, in its way, the truest record of how the farm had stayed alive. That first night after leaving Mr. Caldwell's office, Hazel did not go inside the house. She went to the shed. She pulled the cord on the overhead light, a single incandescent bulb that threw more shadow than brightness, and she sat on the overturned 5-gallon pail her father had always used, and she opened the yellow notepad to the section on the tractor. The tractor was a 1979 International 784, a modest machine, nothing glamorous, but well within what the farm needed. The cracked block was the diagnosis Thomas's mechanic friend had offered from a 30-second look in August, and on that basis, Thomas had declared the tractor a write-off and stopped touching it. Hazel read her father's notes. She read the service manual, and then she went to look at the engine herself, with a flashlight and the particular attention her father had taught her. What she found was not a cracked block. What she found was a failed head gasket, a serious repair, yes, but a knowable one, a repairable one. The symptom that Thomas's mechanic had called a cracked block was coolant intrusion in the oil, which looked catastrophic and was not, provided you caught it before you ran the engine long enough to do real damage. They had not run it. The engine was cold and intact. She found the part number in the notepad. She found the torque sequence in the manual. She drove to the implement dealer in the next county, where no one knew the story about Thomas, and bought the head gasket and the head bolts for just under $47. The repair took her 4 days. She had never done one before. She worked from the manual, step by step, with her father's tools laid out on a clean piece of cardboard in the exact order she removed them, the way he had always insisted. She pulled the head. She cleaned the mating surfaces with a straight edge and a piece of float glass, the way the manual specified. She replaced the bolts, torqued them in sequence, and reassembled everything with a steadiness that surprised even herself. On the 5th morning, she turned the key. The 784 started without drama. She checked the oil. She let it warm. She watched the temperature gauge. Nothing moved that shouldn't. Nothing leaked. She sat in the cab for a long time before she got down. The winter that followed was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, but relentless. She ran the farm on a budget that left no room for error and very little room for comfort. She fed the beef cattle herself, twice a day, in temperatures that made the air feel like something solid pressing against your face. She split firewood on the weekends she might otherwise have rested. She bartered with her neighbor, an older man named Mr. Fenton, who ran the farm 2 concessions north, trading 2 days of her labor, helping him move cattle before the freeze, in exchange for the use of his post-hole digger to repair a fence line she couldn't afford to hire out. She did not buy anything she could fix. She did not fix anything by paying someone else to do it when her father's manuals told her how. There was one night in February that came close to breaking her, a freezing rain event, the kind that the Ottawa Valley gets when a warm front moves in too fast and turns to ice before it finishes falling, had taken down a section of hydro line to the barn. The animals were fine. She'd checked before the ice set. But she was in the farmhouse at 11 o'clock at night, the power out, the backup generator running low on fuel. She hadn't been able to get into town to refill because the roads had been closed since noon, and the weight of the whole winter pressed down on her at once. The debt, the tractor she'd repaired but hadn't been able to fully trust until spring. The maple season that was still 6 weeks away. The fact that there was no one, not a single person, who would come up that driveway to help her unless she asked. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a candle, and her father's yellow notepad, not reading it, just holding it. And she found, tucked inside the back cover, a folded piece of paper she had never seen. It was her father's handwriting, the same block letters, but older. The paper had gone the color of cream. It said, "The land keeps what you give it. Bad years end. The ones who are still here when they do are the ones who didn't let the bad years make the decisions." She read it twice. Then she put on her coat, went out to the generator shed, and found a partial jerry can she had forgotten was there. Enough fuel for the night. She topped the generator up, went back inside, and started a list of everything that needed doing in the morning. The doubt had moved through her and past her the way a cold front eventually passes. The first real sign that she had made the right decision was not the maple harvest, though the maple harvest that spring was a good one. The sugaring season ran 3 weeks, and the syrup graded well, light amber, the kind that's sold at a premium at the farmers' markets in Hawkesbury and Alexandria. The first sign was the land itself. Her father had wintered the fields in a mix of fall rye and clover that his neighbors thought was eccentric and inefficient. Hazel continued it. By her second spring, the soil in the lower fields was darker and held moisture differently after a rain, not puddling the way the bare worked fields on neighboring properties did, but absorbing. The earthworms were extraordinary. She mentioned it to Mr. Fenton one afternoon, and he crouched down and looked at the soil for a long time without saying anything, and then stood up and nodded slowly, which was, coming from Mr. Fenton, practically an ovation. Her input costs were a fraction of what the larger operations around her were spending on fertilizer. Her yields weren't record numbers, but they were consistent, and her margins, because she carried so little debt, were healthier than anything the bigger outfits could claim. Then, in 1990, the thing her father had always called the bill coming due arrived. Interest rates that had been climbing through the late 80s reached levels that made the operating loans so many farms had taken on suddenly look like anchors. Commodity prices for beef softened at the same time. The economics of farm debt, which had seemed manageable when money was cheap, became ruinous when it wasn't. The consolidation companies that had been buying land turned quiet. They were over-leveraged too. The for sale signs that had been going up on neighbors' properties started being replaced, in some cases, by the flat, administrative language of power of sale notices. The Beaumont place, which had already sold once, went into receivership, a younger couple 2 concessions east. People Hazel knew and liked lost their dairy operation in a bank workout that took everything, including the equipment. Hazel's farm stood. Her operating loan was small. Her equipment was old but paid for, save for the loader and baler that Thomas had brought in, which she had paid down aggressively through 2 maple seasons and a good hay year. She carried almost nothing, while the people around her were sitting across tables from bank officers going through restructuring options. She was planning her spring sugaring and evaluating whether to add 2 more lines in the east section of the bush. She was not getting rich. She was doing something harder, and in those years, rarer. She was surviving. In the farm contraction of the early 90s in eastern Ontario, survival was the most consequential achievement available. One afternoon in May of 1991, a car pulled into her yard that she didn't recognize. Mr. Caldwell got out of it. He was dressed for a weekend, not an office, which somehow made him look older than he did in a suit. He walked toward the equipment shed where she was replacing the slip clutch on the baler. The parts laid out on a piece of cardboard, the torque wrench set, her father's manual open to the right page. He stood at the edge of the shed door for a moment and looked around at the organized workspace, the clean equipment, the fields greening beyond the fence line. "Your maple syrup," he said finally. "I bought some at the Hawkesbury market last month. Light amber. It was exceptional." Hazel finished tightening the adjustment nut before she looked up. "It was a good season," she said. He shook his head with the slow movement of a man reconsidering something he'd held for a long time. "No," he said, "it wasn't. It was an extremely difficult season for everyone in the valley." He paused. "I've driven by here a few times this past year. I wasn't sure whether to stop." He looked at the fields. "I wanted to tell you that I was wrong. In that office in '87, I was wrong. I looked at you and saw a problem to be resolved. I should have looked more carefully and seen Ramey Moreau's daughter." He looked down at his hands. "How did you manage it?" "The tractor alone. We had assumed it wasn't a cracked block," she said. "It was the head gasket. My father's notes had the service history. I had the manual. It took 4 days." Mr. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said, "understood something about this land that most of us in the lending business spent 20 years trying to quantify and never could." He reached out his hand. "I'm sorry, Hazel. I should have trusted you." She wiped her hand on a shop rag and shook his. It was a different kind of transaction than the last one they'd had. 3 months after that, a truck she recognized turned into the driveway. Thomas. He was thinner than he'd been. The job in construction had gone, the way construction went in a recession. And the city, it turned out, had not been as accommodating as he'd expected. He stood by his truck and looked at the farm, the way you look at something you walked away from and have spent time since wondering about. The fence lines were straight. The cattle in the near pasture were in good condition. The old 784 was parked clean by the barn. Hazel came out onto the porch steps. He didn't come any closer. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said, "I heard in town you were the only one on your concession who didn't go under." She waited. "I called this place a losing proposition," he said. His voice was quiet in the way voices are when a man is saying something that costs him. "I was wrong about the farm. I was wrong about your father. I was wrong about you." He looked at the fields, then back at her. "I didn't come back to ask for anything. I just came to say that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. It was not a forgiveness exactly. It was something more useful, an acknowledgement that the account had been settled by events and that she had no need to hold it anymore. She turned and went back inside. He got in his truck and drove back down the county road, and she did not watch him go. Let me take you forward now. It is 2009, and Hazel Moreau is 49 years old, which means she has been farming this land without a partner and without significant debt for more than 20 years. The farm is still 300 acres. She has not expanded it because expansion was never the point. She has deepened it instead. Better soil each decade. A maple bush that produces with a consistency that buyers have come to count on. A small herd of beef cattle that she has quietly built a reputation around at 2 regional farmers markets. She owns the property without encumbrance. The hot water tank that was making that noise in 1987 was replaced in 1993 with money she saved from a particularly good syrup season. And she did the installation herself, with help from a plumbing manual and Mr. Fenton, who by then had become something like a neighbor in the old sense of that word. The equipment shed is the same, but better organized than even Ramey kept it. The 784 is still there. It runs. She had the engine rebuilt properly in the late 90s, paid for it in cash, had it done right, and it has not given her cause for concern since. It sits next to a newer utility tractor she bought secondhand in 2001 with money she did not borrow. a decision that seemed eccentric to the implement dealer until he ran the transaction and realized she was writing a check. People come to her now, not in the way she might have expected, not the neighbors, necessarily, though the people who are left on that concession all know her and respect her. It's younger people, agricultural college graduates with expensive certifications and precision agriculture subscriptions who come to her not for those things, but for the other things. How to read a field, how to build soil, how to run an operation that could survive a bad year without being destroyed by the debt load carried from the good ones. She is not evangelical about it. She doesn't lecture. She shows them the yellow notepad, which she has continued in her father's style. Block letters, part numbers, observations. 3 notebooks now, sitting on the same shelf above the same toolbox. One afternoon in October, she is in the shed with her niece, a young woman of 22, named Petra, who has been spending weekends on the farm since August and who has said, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who means it, that she wants to learn. Hazel is showing her how to check the tension on the drive chain of the baler. The same baler Thomas had helped finance, repaired so many times now that almost no original part remains except the frame which her father would have found entirely appropriate. The manual tells you the specification. Hazel says, but the chain will tell you too if you listen. She gives the chain a sideways push with 2 fingers. Hear that? That's right. Now feel this. She deflects it differently. Feel the difference? Petra nods slowly, her hand where Hazel's was. Your great-uncle Remy called it the machine's language, Hazel says. He said every piece of equipment is always talking. Most people don't bother learning to listen. That's fine for them. It just means they'll always need someone else to translate. She hands Petra the notepad, the most recent one, still half empty. You'll keep one of these, she says. It isn't a question. Petra takes it with both hands. Outside, the sugar maples are in full color. Another season coming. The land, as it always does, is keeping what it was given.